The hotel corridor was silent in the way only silence can be when you're deaf. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness that doesn't require ears to feel. I'd been cleaning room 847 of the Marquis Hotel for 3 years, working the night shift because it paid 15% more, and because silence was less lonely when you chose it deliberately. My name is Maya, I'm 28 years old, and I'd spent my entire life in a world without sound, which meant I'd learned to read things other people missed. The tightness of a jaw, the hesitation before a lie, the way a person's shoulders tensed when they were about to hurt someone. That's how I knew, the moment I saw the man being carried into the penthouse suite on the 3rd floor, that his silhouette spelled danger in a language that transcended sound. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive suit that hung on him like armor, and he was bleeding. Not heavily, but enough that someone had wrapped gauze around his left shoulder, enough that the suit jacket had been hastily removed and replaced with a shirt that was clearly borrowed. My cleaning cart was outside room 847, and I was about to move it when I saw him, really saw him. And every instinct I possessed screamed that I should disappear into the walls. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, get ready because today's story is absolutely extraordinary. It's about a woman the world tried to make invisible, a man who could hear her silence, and a love that was literally screamed in a language made of hands and hearts. This isn't just a mafia love story. This is a story about connection that transcends every barrier, including the ones built by violence and crime. This is a story about a deaf woman who saved a mafia boss and a dangerous man who saved her back. Before we dive into this incredible, unexpected journey of silent communication, dangerous love, and redemption, make sure to smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you're going to want to watch every single second of how a woman who couldn't hear became the only person who could truly listen. This story has twists, passion, danger, and a love that defied every expectation and every limitation. Now let's dive into how a woman in complete silence caught the attention of a man drowning in his own chaos. The Marquis Hotel was a 5-star establishment where the wealthy came to disappear, where celebrities conducted affairs, where business deals worth millions were negotiated in private dining rooms. My job as a night shift maid meant I cleaned the evidence of their lives, the empty champagne bottles, the used condoms, the torn pieces of contracts that hadn't been signed, and disappeared before they woke up. I was efficient, I was invisible, and I was perfectly content to remain that way. The fact that I was deaf had been treated by management as either an asset, I wouldn't be disturbed by noise, or a liability, I wouldn't be able to hear requests. But mostly they just forgot I existed entirely. I cleaned 30 rooms a night, moved through the hallways like a ghost, and returned to my small apartment at 6 a.m. where I'd sleep until 4 p.m. and repeat the cycle. My life was small, manageable, and entirely predictable until the moment I saw blood dripping on the marble floor outside room 847. I paused, my hand frozen on my cleaning cart, my eyes reading the scene in front of me the way a crime scene investigator might read evidence. The penthouse entrance was guarded by 2 men in dark suits. Clearly security, clearly dangerous. Their body language communicating a tension that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with the way they positioned themselves between the room and the world. One of them saw my cleaning cart, and I watched his hand move toward his jacket in a gesture that suggested he was reaching for a weapon. But then, and this was the moment everything shifted, the man I'd glimpsed in the hallway appeared in the doorway. He was even more impressive up close, even more dangerous, his dark eyes sweeping over me with a precision that suggested he missed nothing. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top, revealing a bandage on his shoulder, and there was a weariness in his expression that suggested he'd been awake for far too long. He watched me watching him, and something in his gaze shifted, a moment of recognition, though of what I couldn't possibly know. "She's deaf," he said. I watched his lips form the words, watched the way his bodyguard's shoulders relaxed slightly at this information. That's when I realized he'd just made a decision that would determine whether I lived or died based on a fact about me that he shouldn't have known. His name was Dominic Valentino, and he owned half the city's underworld along with significant legitimate business interests that served as the perfect money laundering front. I didn't know this yet, wouldn't know it for hours, but I learned it eventually through the most unexpected method possible. He decided to keep me alive, decided to keep me close, and decided that my deafness wasn't a liability, but an asset. "Let her clean the room," he said to his security team, his accent Italian in a way that suggested old money and older violence. "She won't hear anything. She won't see anything she shouldn't. And if she does—" He paused, letting the threat hang unfinished. "She'll understand that discretion is the only thing keeping her alive." My hands shook as I pushed my cleaning cart into the suite, moving as quickly as possible toward the bedroom where most of the mess appeared to be concentrated. The living room had been converted into what looked like a makeshift hospital. Medical supplies scattered across a glass coffee table, a heating pad positioned on the couch, bottles of prescription painkillers lined up like soldiers. There was blood on the white tile floor, and I understood immediately that I'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than I could navigate. I cleaned methodically, pretending I hadn't seen anything, pretending I wasn't terrified, pretending that my hands weren't shaking hard enough to make the task difficult. The bodyguards watched me constantly, their eyes never leaving my form, and I understood that I was being evaluated, measured against some invisible standard that determined my usefulness, and therefore my continued existence. I cleaned the bedroom, stripped the blood-stained sheets, replaced them with fresh linens, and moved through the living room like a professional who'd cleaned up far worse than this. Because that was the thing about working in a 5-star hotel. You learned quickly that powerful people's lives were messier than everyone else's, and you learned even more quickly that you didn't survive by judging them. You survived by being useful, being silent, and being completely forgettable. When I was almost finished, the man, Dominic, emerged from the master bathroom, now shirtless, revealing the full extent of his injury. A bullet wound, recent, hastily bandaged by someone who wasn't a medical professional. He watched me work, watched me pretend not to notice, and I felt the weight of his observation like a physical thing. "What's your name?" he asked, and I read his lips even though he didn't sign. I was used to people not signing, used to being the one who had to bridge the gap, used to using my voice when I absolutely had to despite how much I hated my own accent. "Maya," I said, my voice rough from disuse from a day spent in silence. He nodded slowly, like he was adding this information to a database he kept in his head. "Maya," he repeated, testing the name. "You're good at being invisible." It wasn't a question. "You're good at forgetting things you see." Again, not a question. I nodded, understanding that my response could determine whether this ended well or ended with me disappearing into the ocean. "I don't hear much," I said, using sign language to communicate while also speaking, a hybrid approach I'd developed over years of existing in a world built for hearing people. "And I don't talk about what I see. It's not my business." Something in his expression shifted, and I realized he was looking at me. Not through me, not past me, but directly at me in a way that felt like being seen for the first time in my life. The next few days were a blur of unusual routine. Dominic didn't check out of room 847. Instead, he stayed, recovering from his wound, conducting business through whispered conversations with men who came and went at irregular intervals. I continued to clean the penthouse, but now it was different. Now I was being watched by Dominic in a way that felt less like a threat and more like protection. He was always there when I arrived, always positioned so he could see me, always making sure his bodyguards didn't intercept me or prevent me from doing my work. On the 4th day, I found a note on the pillow, handwritten in clear print. "Your shift ends at 6 a.m. Don't go home. Come to the restaurant on the 1st floor. Order whatever you want. I'll pay." The restaurant was exclusive, accessible only to guests and staff, and I'd never eaten there during my tenure at the hotel. I almost threw away the note. I almost went home, locked my doors, and pretended this had never happened. But something in me, curiosity perhaps, or the simple fact that I'd spent my entire life being invisible and this man was actively choosing to see me, made me walk downstairs instead. Dominic was already waiting in a private booth, now wearing a black turtleneck that covered his injury, but couldn't hide the way he held himself, as if moving caused pain. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I don't bite. Well, not usually." There was a dark humor in his expression that suggested he'd made jokes like this before, suggestions that violence was simply part of his landscape. I sat, my hands folded on the table to stop them from shaking. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice barely audible even to myself. He leaned forward and I realized he was studying my face with the intensity of someone learning a language entirely new to them. "Because you're the first person in 10 years who's seen me bleed and looked at me like I was human rather than a monster." He paused, waiting for a response I couldn't formulate. "You read lips, don't you? Better than most people here." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted, "it's necessary. Most people don't sign." He nodded like he'd suspected as much. "I want to learn," he said simply. "I want to learn to sign. I want to learn to communicate in the way that comes naturally to you, because I'm tired of existing in a world of lies and verbal deceptions. I want to talk to you the way you talk to the world, with complete clarity. No room for manipulation." Over the next few weeks, Dominic didn't leave the hotel. Instead, he transformed the penthouse into a classroom, and I transformed into his unexpected teacher. Every morning after my shift, instead of going home, I'd climb to the 3rd floor and teach him American Sign Language. My fingers would move, forming letters and words, and his large, dangerous hands would attempt to mimic the movements. We'd sit across from each other, him in pain from his injury but slowly healing, me in the most engaged I'd felt in years, and we'd communicate in a language that stripped away pretense and left only honesty. "I'm sorry," he signed one morning, his movement still imperfect but his intention clear. "For threatening you. For forcing you into the situation." I watched his hands, watched the genuine remorse in his expression, and I realized that learning to sign had changed him somehow. The language of hands forced clarity, forced the kind of authenticity that voices could hide. "You didn't force anything," I signed back. "I chose to stay. I choose to teach. I choose." I trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "You choose what?" he pressed, his hands forming the question with increasing fluency. I looked at his face, at the intensity in his eyes, at the vulnerability that sign language had revealed in him. "You choose me?" he signed, and it was phrased as a question because he didn't yet believe that anyone would choose him. "I choose you," I signed, and I meant it more completely than I'd meant anything in my entire life. Dominic stood up, moving toward me with careful deliberation, and he took my hands in his. We communicated without sound, without words, using only the language we'd built together. "I love you," his hand said, fingers moving with increasing confidence. "I've loved you since you first looked at me like I was human instead of a monster." I cried then, actual tears streaming down my face because I'd spent my entire life in silence, and this man was the first person who'd ever truly listened. Not with his ears, but with everything else. That night, Dominic Valentino, one of the most dangerous men in the city, made love to me with the kind of tenderness that suggested he'd been waiting his entire life to touch someone who could understand him completely. There were no words, no misunderstandings, no hidden meanings. Just two people communicating through touch and through hands, and through a look that transcended every language ever invented. When it was over, we lay in the darkness of the penthouse, and he pulled me close. "I'm a dangerous man," he signed to me in the darkness, his hands visible in the moonlight. "I've done terrible things. I've hurt people. I've built an empire on blood and fear." I didn't respond with words or signs. Instead, I placed my hand on his heart and felt it beating, felt the humanity underneath all the violence. "I know," I finally signed. "And I'm staying anyway." The world outside the penthouse was not as forgiving as the world we'd built inside it. When Dominic's rival, a man named Salvatore, who controlled the southern territories, discovered that the mafia boss had fallen for a deaf hotel maid, the information became a weapon. One morning as I was heading to work, I felt the vibration of a car pulling up beside me, felt the impact of a hand grabbing my arm. I was pulled into a van, thrown into the back, and surrounded by men whose faces I couldn't read because I was too terrified to focus on lip reading. They took me to a warehouse and I understood with absolute clarity that I was being used as leverage against Dominic. I was tied to a chair. My hands, which were my primary way of communicating, were bound, and I was left alone for hours with nothing but my racing thoughts and the vibrations of footsteps above my head. When Salvatore finally appeared, he was smiling in a way that suggested he believed he'd won something. "Your boyfriend is very attached to you," he said, positioning himself so I could read his lips. "He's going to have to choose his empire or his deaf maid. I wonder which one he'll pick." I couldn't respond, my hands bound, my communication stolen along with my freedom. But I thought about Dominic, about the way he'd learned to sign, about the clarity that gesture language had brought to his life. I thought about the fact that he'd chosen to learn my language, chosen to meet me halfway, chosen to build a bridge across the distance between us. If there was anyone in the world who would choose love over power, it was the man who'd spent years drowning in power and had finally learned what it felt like to drown in something else entirely. The rescue was swift and brutal. Dominic appeared at the warehouse with what seemed like half the city's underworld at his back, and he moved through Salvatore's men like an avenging angel. I watched from my chair, my hands still bound, unable to communicate, completely helpless, and I witnessed the moment Dominic Valentino, the man who'd learned to sign, who'd found gentleness with me, became the monster he'd warned me he was. When he reached me, his hands were shaking with a rage so profound it seemed to emanate from his very core. "Are you hurt?" he signed, his movements sharp and aggressive, the sign language equivalent of shouting. "Did they hurt you?" I shook my head frantically, tears streaming down my face. He cut my bonds, and the moment my hands were free, I signed the first thing that came to mind. Run. But when I tried to pull him toward the exit, when I tried to drag him away from the confrontation that was still unfolding around us, he grabbed my wrist. "Not without you," he signed, his free hand moving with absolute determination. "I will never run without you. I will never leave you. I will never choose anything over you again." The sincerity in his expression, the clarity in his hands made my heart stop. This was a man who'd built his entire existence on survival, on dominance, on power, and he was choosing to stand beside me instead of fleeing. We ran together, his hand locked around my wrist, and I understood that we were no longer two separate people. We were a unit, bound by something that transcended words or sound. The aftermath of the rescue was explosive. Dominic's organization fractured as men who'd seen him choose love over power decided they could no longer follow him. But Dominic didn't seem to care. Instead, he liquidated his criminal holdings, transferred his legitimate businesses to trusted associates, and began the process of building a new life, one based not on violence and fear, but on something entirely different. "I want to disappear with you," he signed one evening as we sat in a hotel room in a small town 3 hours from the city. "I want to build a life where the only thing that matters is this, us. No empire, no power, just us." I signed back. "I've been invisible my whole life. I don't want to disappear anymore. I want to be seen." Dominic pulled me close. Then I'll be visible together. We started over in Portland, Oregon, in a small community with a strong deaf culture. Dominic opened a restaurant, legitimate, legal, profitable, and I became the manager. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was working in a space that had been designed with me in mind. The restaurant had a visual bell system instead of an audio one. There were visual displays for orders instead of verbal callouts. And perhaps most importantly, many of our staff members were deaf and sign language was as common as spoken English. Dominic learned to thrive in this new environment, learned to see the world the way I'd always seen it, visually, carefully, with attention to gesture and expression. Our restaurant became famous not just for the food, but for the atmosphere, for the way it felt like a sanctuary for people who'd always felt like outsiders. 6 months after opening the restaurant, Dominic proposed to me on the waterfront of the Willamette River, and he did it in sign language. He dropped to one knee, and his hands formed the words, "Will you marry me?" It was simple, it was beautiful, and it was perfect. The ring was custom made with my birthstone, an amethyst, surrounded by diamonds that caught the light in a way that made me think about how clearly I could finally see my own future. "Yes," I signed, pulling him into a kiss that tasted like redemption and new beginnings. Our wedding took place in the restaurant with a reception that celebrated our connection in every way. Deaf friends, hearing friends, people from both our worlds coming together to witness a union that had been forged in silence and had emerged as something more beautiful than any spoken vow could ever be. When it came time for the traditional wedding dance, Dominic held me close and I could feel the vibrations of the music through his chest, could feel the rhythm that had been lost to him, but was now being translated through touch. We danced to a song called Quiet, and the irony was exquisite. We were dancing to silence, celebrating a love that had been built in the absence of sound. Our first year of marriage was marked by the complete transformation of Dominic's life. He hired a tutor and became fluent in American Sign Language, not just as a way to communicate with me, but as a way to communicate with the entire deaf community. He became an advocate, funding schools for deaf children, creating job opportunities for deaf adults, using his resources and his platform to dismantle the barriers that had made my life so small for so long. I watched him work with wonder, still sometimes unable to believe that this man, this dangerous, powerful, violent man, had chosen to spend his life building rather than destroying. When I discovered I was pregnant, I told him by signing to him, hands moving against his chest so he could feel the vibrations of the words before he could see them. "We're going to have a baby." I signed. He cried, actually cried, and he signed back. "I want them to know sign language before they speak. I want them to understand that there's more than one way to communicate, more than one way to exist in the world." Our daughter, Rose, was born with perfect hearing, but from her first day we taught her to sign. She grew up bilingual in the most literal sense, comfortable in both the hearing and deaf worlds, a bridge between two communities that had tried for so long to stay separate. But the past has a way of catching up, even in small towns, even when you've tried so hard to leave it behind. Salvatore, the rival who'd kidnapped me, escaped from prison on a technicality and came looking for revenge. He wanted to reclaim the territories Dominic had abandoned, wanted to prove that Dominic had made him look weak by choosing love over power. One evening, as I was closing the restaurant, he appeared with a gun. "Tell your husband he made a mistake," Salvatore said, positioning the gun at my head. "Tell him that love was always going to be a weakness." But I didn't tell Dominic anything. Instead, I ran, my hands moving frantically, signing warnings that Dominic could see from across the restaurant. "Gun! Run!" I signed, even as fear threatened to paralyze me. But Dominic didn't run. Instead, he moved toward me with a purpose that transcended self-preservation. He grabbed my wrist just like he had in the warehouse, just like he had when he decided he would never leave me. And he signed with his free hand. "Not without you." The violence that followed was brief and brutal, and when it was over, Salvatore was no longer a threat. Dominic was injured again, a graze wound on his arm, but he was alive, and more importantly, we were alive. The police came, and Dominic gave a statement, truthfully, completely, holding nothing back, because he'd learned that transparency was more powerful than deception. He went to trial, but because Salvatore had been the aggressor and because Dominic's self-defense was clear-cut, he was acquitted. The man who'd built an empire on violence had finally stepped into the light. After the trial, Dominic made a decision. He would use his vast resources to build a foundation, the Valentino Institute for Deaf Empowerment, dedicated to providing scholarships, resources, and opportunities to deaf individuals. He would use the empire he'd built through crime to rebuild the world in a way that honored people like me, people who'd always been made to feel like their silence was a liability rather than an asset. The foundation grew rapidly, opening branches in 12 cities, directly impacting thousands of lives. Dominic became known not as a mob boss or a criminal, but as a philanthropist, a businessman, a man who'd used his wealth for good. 2 years after Rose was born, we had a son, Samuel, who was born deaf. Dominic's response was immediate and certain. "He's perfect," he signed to me in the hospital room, his hands forming the words with absolute conviction. "He doesn't need to be fixed or changed. He just needs to be loved and supported." Samuel grew up surrounded by sign language, surrounded by the deaf community, and he grew up understanding that his deafness wasn't a disability. It was simply a different way of experiencing the world. Dominic learned to navigate the world as Samuel's father, learning to be patient, learning to advocate, learning to fight for his son the way he'd learned to fight for me. 5 years later, we stood in the restaurant we'd built together, watching Rose and Samuel play with other deaf children, watching Dominic interact with them in fluent sign language, watching a man who'd once built an empire on violence now build a world on love and acceptance. A journalist approached me, wanting to write a story about my life, about how I'd met Dominic, about how a deaf woman had changed a mafia boss's life. I declined the interview, but I agreed to pose for a photograph. In the photo, Dominic stands behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist, and we're both signing, his hands and my hands forming words that only we understand. The caption reads, "In the language of hands, they found the language of the heart of..." So that's our story, everyone. From a deaf maid in a silent world to a woman who taught a dangerous man what it means to truly listen. If this story moved you, if it made you believe that love transcends every barrier, including sound itself, please smash that like button. Share this with someone who needs to know that being different isn't a disability, it's a gift. Don't forget to subscribe because we have so many more stories of connection, redemption, and the power of truly seeing another person. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, did you believe that Dominic could truly change from a violent criminal to a man who signed? Do you think learning sign language fundamentally changed who he was? Or did he just discover who he'd always been underneath the violence? Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt truly seen by another person, the way Maya was seen? Tell me, hands that speak, if this story about silent love touched your heart. Tell me, not without you, if you believe that real love means never running alone. Tell me, sign of grace. If you think Dominic's transformation was earned and real. Tell me visible love if you believe that being made visible by another person is the most powerful kind of transformation. See you in the next video. Remember, sometimes the most powerful conversations happen without a single word being spoken.